Before we begin, if you appreciate deep historical research, we've set up a Ko-fi page to support this work directly. The link is in the description. Now, let's discuss something that occurred in the Pacific, which highlights a pattern of failure within the highest levels of the Japanese military. Guadalcanal, August 1942. The island is part of the Solomon Islands chain, southeast of the Japanese perimeter. It is not crucial to strategy. It is not heavily defended. It is not the centerpiece of Japanese expansion in the Pacific. Yet, it became the site where the Japanese military repeated the same disastrous error 3 times. They sent their best generals to use the same failed strategy until the consequences became too severe to ignore. This is not merely a tale of flawed military strategy. It reflects institutional blindness. It shows how high command made a decision, failed, and then repeated the same decision, expecting different results. The 3 generals were among Japan's best military minds. They had experience and respect. They understood warfare. However, they all made the same mistakes because they were following a flawed premise from Tokyo. The first general, Alexander Vandergrift's arrival. Wait, let me back up. In August 1942, American forces under General Alexander Vandergrift landed on Guadalcanal. The landing faced some opposition, but not heavy. The Americans secured the island's airfield and began strengthening their position. Tokyo received reports. The island was taken. An enemy foothold existed in Japanese territory. A response was necessary. High Command decided that the island would be retaken. They planned to do so quickly and with minimal forces because they believed American troops were inherently weaker in jungle warfare and hand-to-hand combat. This is not speculation. It is documented in Japanese military records and in post-war interrogations of Japanese officers. It appears in the diaries of Japanese commanders. They believed American soldiers could not fight in jungle conditions like Japanese soldiers could. So, Tokyo sent the first general, Ichiki Masahiro. Jindala, Ichiki Masahiro, the first attempt. Ichiki was competent. He had experience from serving in China. High Command assigned him a straightforward mission: land on Guadalcanal with a small force, overwhelm the American garrison, and retake the airfield. High Command estimated he would need around 2,000 men. They gave him 900, not because that was a calculated necessity, but because they thought that would be enough. They believed American soldiers would crumble under assault, and that Japanese warriors, fighting in their own environment in the jungle at night, in close combat, would intimidate American defenders. Ichiki arrived in August 1942. He landed his force and immediately attacked the American position without waiting for reinforcements or reconnaissance. The attack failed. His men suffered heavy losses. Ichiki was killed. The operation was a disaster. High Command in Tokyo received the reports and analyzed what went wrong. This is where the institutional blindness emerges. They did not conclude that they had misjudged American fighting ability. They did not conclude that 900 men were too few. They did not reconsider their strategic premise. Instead, they decided that Ichiki simply lacked enough men. They believed the mission failed due to an insufficient force. They thought that if they sent a larger group with a better general using the same strategy, success was possible. The second general, Kawaguchi, Kiyotake. High Command chose Kawaguchi Kiyotake. He was senior to Ichiki, had more experience, and was seen as more cautious and strategic. High Command provided Kawaguchi with a larger force, around 6,000 men, but assigned him the same mission: land on Guadalcanal, attack the Americans, and retake the airfield. Kawaguchi arrived in September 1942. Unlike Ichiki, he waited. He organized his troops, planned an attack, and prepared carefully. Then, he launched his assault, using the same strategy as Ichiki, a nighttime attack with close combat, attempting to overpower the American position through sheer will and warrior spirit. The attack failed. Kawaguchi lost thousands of men. The Americans held firm. Kawaguchi had to withdraw. Again, High Command received reports. Again, they analyzed the failure. And once more, they reached the same conclusion: not that the strategy was flawed, but that the force was too small. They decided to send a third general. They decided to send more troops while sticking to the same basic strategy. Third general, Hyakutake Harukichi. By November 1942, High Command sent General Hyakutake Harukichi. He was the senior commander and had nominal authority over all Japanese operations in the Solomon Islands. He was given a massive force, 20,000 men or more. Hyakutake arrived in November. He assessed the situation. He acknowledged that Ichiki failed, that Kawaguchi failed. He studied their reports and understood what went wrong. Despite this, Hyakutake decided to do precisely what Ichiki and Kawaguchi did. He planned a major nighttime assault. He aimed to overwhelm the American position through firepower. He assumed that if he simply had enough troops and used them decisively, the American defense would collapse. The assault took place in November 1942. It was the largest surface action of the entire Pacific War, later known as the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. The assault failed. Hyakutake lost thousands of men. The Americans also lost troops. Naval vessels sank on both sides. In the end, however, the American position remained intact. Hyakutake reached a conclusion that Tokyo had avoided. The island could not be taken using the strategies that had been applied. The costs were too high. The American defense was too strong. The island should be abandoned. In December 1942, Tokyo reluctantly agreed. They abandoned the island. The operation concluded. Why this matters: 3 generals, 3 separate attempts, 3 identical strategies, 3 failures. What's notable is not that the first attempt failed. Military operations can fail. What's noteworthy is that High Command repeated the same strategic assumption after each failure. They sent a new general to carry out the same plan, and did so again a 3rd time. This is not just a story about strategy. It illustrates an institutional failure to adjust when evidence contradicts core beliefs. Tokyo's core belief was that American soldiers could not fight in the jungle, could not handle night combat, could not withstand the psychological impact of a Japanese attack. This belief was deeply rooted in Japanese military culture. It was taught in officer training and built into their warrior philosophy. When evidence contradicted this belief, Tokyo did not revise it. Instead, they adjusted the parameters. If a strategy failed, it must have been due to a lack of manpower, not because the strategy itself was flawed. The broader pattern. This trend continued throughout the Pacific War, not only at Guadalcanal, but across various theaters. The Japanese military would form a strategic belief. Evidence would contradict it. Rather than change the belief, High Command would adjust the resources and try again. Ichiki had 900 men, Kawaguchi had 6,000, and Hyakutake had 20,000. Each time, the strategy failed not because of a shortage of men, but because the fundamental assumption about American fighting capabilities was mistaken. What makes this particularly significant is that it was not a secret. Ichiki's officers survived and reported their findings. Kawaguchi's officers also survived and provided reports. The intelligence was available to Tokyo, but the institutional response was not to alter the belief. Instead, the response was to commit more resources to the same failing strategy. The mistake before the mission. Now, let's discuss something connected to this pattern, but different in its specifics. Let's talk about the Yamato. In April 1945, the Japanese military made a decision. The war was lost. This was clear to every officer above the rank of major. The Americans had island-hopped to striking distance of the Japanese homeland. The Navy had been devastated. The Air Force had been crippled. Fuel was running low. Yet, Tokyo chose to send the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, one of the last intact capital ships Japan had, on a one-way mission to Okinawa. The mission was named Operation Ten-Go. The Yamato would sail to Okinawa, ground itself, and use its powerful guns to support the island's defense. The ship would not return. The crew and officers knew this. However, before the ship left port, a mistake had already been made: the operational plan. The mistake is not in deciding to send the ship. By April 1945, it has become standard practice for the Japanese to send ships on one-way missions. The error lies in the operational plan itself. The Yamato is set to sail to Okinawa with minimal escort, just a cruiser and a few destroyers. There will be no air cover or fighter protection. The Yamato was built to fight other battleships and meant for surface combat against enemy capital ships. However, by April 1945, naval battles were fought primarily by aircraft. The Yamato will undertake a mission where it is vulnerable to air attacks, with no defense against them. Its anti-aircraft guns are powerful, yet they cannot effectively counter coordinated attacks from carrier-based aircraft. The officers planning the operation understand this. The records confirm their awareness. The Chief of Naval Operations knew as well. Yet, they sent the Yamato anyway. Why? Because the same institutional blindness that led to Ichiki being sent with 900 men and then Kawaguchi with 6,000 was still present. There was an assumption that the Yamato's mere presence at Okinawa would create sufficient psychological impact. The operational plan was built on hope rather than a realistic assessment of the military situation. What happened? The Yamato sailed in April 1945 and was detected almost immediately. American aircraft launched attacks, hitting the ship repeatedly. It sank in shallow water after taking hits no ship could reasonably withstand. The crew suffered heavy losses. Most of the 2,200 men aboard were killed. The Yamato, an impressive feat of military engineering, was wasted on a mission doomed before it even left port. The mistake was not the decision to go. The mistake was the operational plan that overlooked the actual military situation, relying instead on hope that the enemy would not respond effectively. The institutional tavillas. What links Guadalcanal to the Yamato is not geography or strategy in the traditional sense. It connects through a failure to adjust when evidence contradicts assumptions. At Guadalcanal, the belief was that American soldiers couldn't succeed in jungle conditions. Evidence proved otherwise. Instead of revising the assumption, Tokyo sent more troops to repeat the same strategy. In the case of the Yamato, the belief was that the operation would succeed despite clear vulnerabilities. The planners were aware the ship would face air attacks and that their defenses were inadequate. Yet, they proceeded, hoping for a different result. This isn't strategy, it's wishful thinking dressed up as operational planning. Why this is historically significant. The Guadalcanal pattern: send a general, fail, send a larger force, fail again, send an even larger force, reveals an important fact about military institutions under pressure. When institutions commit to a strategic idea, they don't revise that idea when it fails. Instead, they increase the resources. They send more men and materials, hoping for better outcomes. This happens because changing the strategic idea means admitting the entire way of thinking was wrong. It requires humility and an acceptance that core assumptions were flawed. Tokyo couldn't do this. It could not accept that the military doctrine taught in officer schools was incorrect. It could not acknowledge that American soldiers were capable of jungle warfare and night combat. So, Tokyo sent Ichiki. After Ichiki failed, it sent Kawaguchi. When Kawaguchi failed, it sent Hyakutake. Each time, more men were sent with the same strategy. The pattern persisted throughout the war. Some commanders understood the situation had changed, but at the institutional level, Tokyo failed to adjust. The documentation. All of this is recorded. Japanese military records captured after the war provide insight into the decision-making process. American military historians have studied these records in detail. The pattern is evident. What's important is that Japanese officers after the war recognized this pattern. In post-war interviews, they discussed the Guadalcanal campaign and admitted Tokyo's assumption about American fighting capability was wrong. They acknowledged that strategy should have changed after Ichiki's failure. However, they explained that adjusting the strategy was difficult because it meant admitting the assumption was incorrect and that the entire military doctrine was flawed. Institutions struggle to make those admissions. The lesson for institutional behavior. What the Guadalcanal campaign teaches us isn't just about military strategy. It reveals how institutions behave when faced with evidence that conflicts with their fundamental beliefs. Institutions do not revise their assumptions. Instead, they modify their tactics. If the strategy fails, they send more resources. If that fails, they send even more. The assumption itself is never questioned. This behavior is not unique to the Japanese military in 1942. It appears repeatedly in institutions throughout history. When institutions cling to a particular way of thinking, they will exhaust resources trying to make it work before they change their thinking. The Yamato reflects a later version of this pattern. By 1945, it was clear the war was lost, yet, rather than reassess the notion that Japan could influence the outcome with remaining resources, Tokyo sent the Yamato on a mission that was doomed from the start. What we know. We know Ichiki was sent with 900 men and failed. We know Tokyo then sent Kawaguchi with 6,000 men to execute a similar strategy, which also failed. We know that Tokyo then sent Hyakutake with 20,000 men to try the same approach again. The pattern of failure did not inspire strategic change. Instead, it led to increased resource commitment. We know the Yamato was sent on a mission where it faced aircraft attacks, and that the planners were aware of this risk. We know the ship sank as expected. We know this because the records survived. Japanese military officers filed reports, and American historians have studied them. Time has also allowed the documents to be declassified. Why this matters today. The Guadalcanal pattern is not just a historical curiosity. It offers insight into how institutions react under stress. When organizations commit to a specific strategic framework, they often focus on making it work rather than revising the framework itself. This occurs even when evidence clearly shows the framework is flawed. Tokyo could have learned from Ichiki's failure. It could have accepted our assumptions about American fighting capability are wrong, and our strategy needs revision. Instead, Tokyo concluded, we need more men. The cost was thousands of lives and resources that could have been used elsewhere. It also meant sticking to a strategy that was bound to fail. The Yamato symbolizes the ultimate cost of institutional devotion to flawed assumptions. By April 1945, the belief that Japan could still affect the war's outcome with remaining capital ships was clearly false. Yet, the institution was committed to that belief, and so the Yamato was dispatched anyway. Closing observation. The Japanese military at Guadalcanal made a significant error by misjudging American fighting capability. This happens in war. However, what made it notable was not the initial mistake, but the institutional response. Not correction, but escalation. Send more men. If that fails, send even more. The fundamental assumption is never questioned. This pattern of institutional resistance to change appears throughout military history and more broadly in institutional history. The generals sent to Guadalcanal were among Japan's best. Ichiki was capable, Kawaguchi was experienced, and Hyakutake was respected. None were incompetent. They were skilled military leaders. But they operated within a system that didn't allow for revisions of core beliefs. They could only adjust the resources tied to the same strategy. The same pattern that led to 3 generals repeating the same error at Guadalcanal also sent the Yamato on a futile mission to Okinawa in April 1945, fully aware that the ship would be sunk. Both situations revealed the same institutional blindness. When evidence contradicts assumptions, institutions prioritize increasing resources instead of revising their thinking. Before we close, if you found value in this exploration of how military institutions behave and make historical decisions, we have a Ko-fi page to support ongoing research. The link is in the description. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring enough to understand not only what happened but also why it happened.